So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I decided to write about the Vietnam War, specifically the book that I wrote. What influenced that journey? Of course, my experience in the war. I want to just share something very briefly with you about that because when I served in Vietnam in 1969, my service turned out to be quite varied. I'd been varied as an infantry officer in that I commanded a platoon for a couple of months and then a company, an infantry company in the 101st. That experience, though, was somewhat varied than some people had garnered from theirs. And that is, the first couple of months I was there, I was paired up, my platoon and later the company was paired up with some Vietnamese regional force units protecting villages. That experience is frankly not something that I thought I was going to have, but it was an eye-opener in that I got to see on the ground in the villages how the Vietnamese lived, how the government was attempting to establish security, and how it was also attempting to establish political rule. Right after that, 6 months then, as many people did, many of you perhaps, my company was sent out to, in those days, instead of search and destroy, they used the euphemism of recon and force. So we went after the big base camps and the North Vietnamese units. Soon after that, I was then assigned to the 101st Airborne Division headquarters up in Camp Eagle. And I want to share that briefly with you because I was asked to join the headquarters because the headquarters general officers always wanted officers out of the field that they could get their viewpoints from those who've served in the field in any of their deliberations. So in that capacity, I got to sit in on some of the meetings between the division and corps commanders and General Abrams, who was then the MACB commander, and others. So that varied experience in my year there in Vietnam of being an infantry platoon leader, company commander in both the populated areas and in the jungle base camps and also up in division headquarters sort of gave me a perspective that later on in the writing of my book and the research, I think it armed me to understand a little bit more than I would have. What influenced my journey, of course, like perhaps some of you, in my tours, unfortunately, I lost 6 soldiers in my command, KIAs, and a dozen WIAs. I also lost 29 classmates out of West Point. So that always stays with you. And obviously, as I went along, this was a motive of finding out what happened over there and why we didn't succeed in our original objectives to defend Vietnam from communism. What started my journey is that soon after I got back, after I had served in training camps in the Ranger School, training Rangers to go to Vietnam, I was sent to graduate school in preparation for a teaching assignment at West Point, University of North Carolina. While I was there, I woke up one morning to the headlines that you can see on this screen, the fall of Saigon. It was an eye-opener for me, and I began to question then, what was all the sacrifice about? Why did we lose? Because I hadn't been keeping track of it. I was too busy training other soldiers to go there. So that immediately caught my attention about going to my professors and see if in my graduate studies I might have the opportunity perhaps to look at some materials to research what were we trying to do there and what went wrong. Well, I had some faculty advisors who were more than willing to help me along there. And the one source that was available was the Pentagon Papers, which, if you recall, was released through the New York Times, a group of papers that were written as a study for McNamara when he was Secretary of Defense to take a look at the history of our involvement there in policy making. And those papers, which really numbered some 7,000 pages, were encapsulated. The New York Times release, of course, was a fraction of that. But one of the senators at the time decided to put several volumes of the choice papers together in what was known as the Gravel edition. And those are the things, that's the source I began to study first as part of my graduate studies, University of North Carolina. And I ran across this particular memo from an Assistant Secretary of Defense, John McNaughton, to the Secretary of Defense McNamara. And this caught my eye, as I'm sure it would have caught some of yours. And coupled with the fall of Saigon, the defeat of Vietnam, the loss of classmates and comrades, I just couldn't understand how 70% of the United States aim there was to avoid a humiliating defeat to our reputation as a guarantor. And only 10%, of course, was to help the people of South Vietnam. That caught my attention. So as I progressed, right after graduate school, and I finished my papers and my requirements, I went on to West Point, where I had my first opportunity to continue to study the war, read more of the Pentagon papers, but there were stories and memoirs coming out. And there were some early histories that I'll share with you that were also being published by the late 70s by some of the journalists who had served in Vietnam that were becoming rather popular. So this became my first opportunity to study the war. My second opportunity, which may seem strange, was my assignment in the Pentagon. I had two of them, one in the early 80s and one in the late 80s. And why I said this is an opportunity, it's really an opportunity in retrospect, because the Pentagon I served in had the same system and process for programming and policy making and everything else has been established by McNamara during the war. So I got firsthand to experience what it was like. I also got to see the policy making, because the national security apparatus, the National Security Council, the participation by the Secretary of Defense and the chairman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that process and that organization had been established before McNamara had showed up. So I had an opportunity, that's one way of looking at it, is experiencing the same process and the same organizations that McNamara ran during the Vietnam War and after McNamara served as well. So it gave me some viewpoints and a perspective about what I would read later. Another opportunity was when years later, I was assigned in my last assignment to the National War College as a professor there. And I decided to develop a course on the Vietnam War. It was the first one that was being taught in the war colleges. So I was able then, in 1994, to gather more materials together and put together more perspectives and share them with the students. So it created a dialogue that I benefited from later on, and it was very worthwhile. Years after that, the Center for Oral History was established at West Point. And many of my classmates were called in to give their oral histories of their experiences in the Vietnam War. I was one of them. And I participated in helping out the history department put together a series of papers that the people who were doing the oral interviews would be able to use in their oral interviews. So I began to collect some of my thoughts from those interviews that I would then later benefit putting my book together. All right, so much for how all this came about. Soon, when I got serious about how to do this, I had to think about how I was going to approach this. And these three things right here, these three pictures, sort of summarize my approach. On the left-hand side, you'll see Winston Churchill, who made this comment about the Soviet Union. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Well, that quote sort of hit me as exactly the way the Vietnam War was felt by our policymakers, a riddle, and that it was something that they had never seen before in terms of a strange war, wrapped in a mystery called Vietnam and Indochina, and turned out to be an enigma, and that the people that they had contact with or had intelligence on, both from the North and the South, seemed very, very strange to them. And they didn't understand them because they didn't act like they act as rational people. I felt that perhaps one of the reasons why this was such a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma is that much of the history that was being written about it was like this, taking a look at an elephant one piece or one part at a time. That is, people were writing the history during a certain set phase of the war, like during the McNamara years or during a certain period leading only from the war when it began for the U.S. in 65 until it ended in 72, or they took a perspective only from the American side and not the Vietnamese, and certainly not North Vietnamese side. So what I wanted to do was to approach it sort of like the entire elephant. Let's see what the whole thing looks like. I knew I was going to take a pretty big bite at that big elephant, but it seemed to me to be the way to go about it. And so that was my basic approach. However, I did read a book later on toward the latter part of my service and into the next part of my retirement by H.R. McMaster, as some of you may have heard, wrote a book called Dereliction of Duty. And what he did is he took a look at the policy making in Washington, D.C. specifically, and he wanted to take a look at the role that the military played in their interface and relationships with their civilian leaders. Now, this was only really during, a little bit during the Kennedy years, but mostly, as you can see by the title here, during Lyndon Johnson's McNamara's tenure from 64 to 68. I wanted to expand that and to see the kind of relationships that McMaster exposed went beyond that period of time and the impact it may have had, not just on Johnson and McNamara, but also on perhaps the Kennedy policy making and certainly afterwards Nixon. So that was my approach.